Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at another video from the channel What Would You Say? This one is about the genocides of the Old Testament, so we know it's going to be a well thought out response that will adequately explain how a perfectly good and merciful God could possibly have commanded and committed genocide, right? Nah, I'm just kidding. It'll probably be one of those "they were so evil that they deserved it" videos. Let's go!
You're in a conversation and someone says, if God is so good, how could he command genocide in the Old Testament? What would you say?
I would say that God's body count is larger than any other characters in the Bible, including Satan. Our God is a murderous God.
In Old Testament passages such as Deuteronomy 7,
Deuteronomy 7 wouldn't be my first choice of an example of genocide in the Bible. I would be more likely to head over to Joshua or 1 Samuel. But yeah, Deuteronomy 7 does lay out some genocidal tendencies.
God commands the Israelites not only to drive out the people who lived in the land of Canaan, known as the Canaanites, but also to take over their land and destroy them all. If God is so good, how could he command his people to do such a thing? The next time you're in a conversation and that question comes up, here are 3 things to remember. Number 1, God's command for Israel to drive out the Canaanites was not race-based, but behavior-based.
So fucking what? Are you trying to argue that it's not technically genocide if it weren't race-based? Because, firstly, that's not true. It can be national or cultural as well, and given how fond the Bible is of using phrases about driving out the nations before Israel, it fits squarely into the definition of genocide. And secondly, I killed them all because some of them were behaving badly is not a great defense, even if it's not technically genocide, which it absolutely is.
As the Canaanites engaged in acts that would be considered criminal in civilized societies.
Jephthah murdered his daughter for coming out to greet him when he came home from war, and that action is written about as though Jephthah were a righteous man doing what was right, even though it caused him great pain. Lot was the only righteous man in Sodom, and the act that earned him that title was the offering of his daughters up to a mob to be raped. Jacob was righteous because he tricked his dying father into giving him his brother's inheritance. Moses was righteous even when he was commanding his army to take the young girls as sex slaves. I could go on. The Israelites did not show any sign of being less morally reprehensible than their neighbors.
In Canaanite culture, horrific acts such as infant sacrifice, ritual sex, bestiality, and incest were not only legal, but common.
Well, I don't see anything inherently wrong with ritual sex as long as all parties are consenting. I know that you have it there for the shock value, but that's really not all that bad. Though I will be the first to admit that a woman living in such a time likely didn't have the ability to opt out, and so such behavior would effectively be a form of rape. So yes, very bad. But not bad for the reasons that the Israelites would have considered it bad. Sadly, the desires of the women didn't seem to be considered very often in the Bible. The bestiality was likely a trumped-up charge. There's really no evidence outside of the Bible of such behavior, and research has shown that bestiality as a behavior is rare and has remained at about the same rate throughout most of human history, with most instances being attributed to horny teenagers living rurally with no access to human partners, just using the animals as a temporary relief measure. As to the infant sacrifice, it couldn't have been too common, otherwise there wouldn't have been any need for the Israelites to come and kill the rest of the kids, right? And really, that's the whole problem here. What does it matter how they behaved? How would that possibly justify killing their children and their innocent citizens who didn't engage in such behaviors? Does the fact that some of them killed some of their children some of the time somehow justify killing all of them and all of their children? If a horny teenager rubs one out on a sheep, does that mean that his newborn baby sister deserves to die at an enemy soldier's hand? This sort of morality via escalating retribution seems unnecessarily harsh, cruel, and yes, even evil if you ask me. But then, even with these weak-ass justifications, they look more like Hebrew authors exaggerating the behaviors that they disapproved of in these people in order to make them look like they are definitely the bad guys in the story, which was a fairly common practice among ancient writers. So chances are the ancient Canaanites were a pretty typical ancient Near Eastern civilization that the Hebrews felt the need to write as the villains of the story in order to justify their conquest.
This behavior had been going on for centuries and was integral to the worship of their idols.
Sorry, but I don't think there will ever be an amount of bad that a group of people could be that would ever convince me that killing all of them is the only reasonable solution, no matter how many hundreds of years they have supposedly engaged in this activity for.
These acts of cruel injustice had God's attention.
And being an all-powerful God, he was surely able to institute swift and specific punishments for the people who engaged in those bad behaviors, and only those people, thus creating a negative feedback loop that would cull out that behavior altogether, right? Surely that's within God's abilities.
Because God is just. He cares about the victims of injustice.
You say that, but the Bible literally says that he ordered his chosen people to further victimize the victims of injustice. Hey you, over there, you're a bad person for trying to kill your baby, so because I care about your baby, I'm going to kill you and your baby. Can you find the moral flaw in that statement?
At the same time, God's judgment wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. For centuries, God had waited patiently for the Canaanites to repent.
And you don't see how that makes this so much worse? He waited centuries, allowing thousands, possibly even millions of Canaanites to live out their lives in this immoral way, thus, in the Christian view, assuring them all of prime real estate in the eternal torture chamber of hell, when God, because of that whole omniscience thing, knew right from the outset how it was going to end up for those people. If genocide were really the only option, an immediate genocide would have been way less immoral than a genocide after waiting hundreds of years. Still would have been massively immoral, but less so.
In other Old Testament passages, God demonstrates that he desires mercy over judgment and is always willing to relent from judgment if the people are willing to repent.
Okay, excellent. Then I know that I can sincerely repent after I die and am standing before God's throne of judgment, right? Since God always prefers it when people repent? That seems like a nifty little loophole to me. Of course, the whole Jesus thing is just a loophole anyway. Bible God sure does love him some technicalities.
In fact, God had a reputation for showing mercy.
Are we reading the same book here? Is this not the guy who flooded the whole planet to kill all life because one specific species was acting up? Or the guy who messed with Pharaoh's free will so that he had a chance to show off his powers by sending plague after plague to the whole nation of Egypt, culminating in his killing of all of their firstborn children? Or the guy who got so mad that the Israelites wanted more than just manna to eat for their 40-year journey across the desert that he struck them with a plague for eating quail that he told them he was going to provide for them? If you keep this stuff in mind, then all those lines in the Old Testament talking about how amazingly good, loving, and merciful God is come across as people desperately trying to make him feel like they love and adore him, lest he become angry and go on a murderous rampage.
Not only to Israel, but also toward Israel's enemies. For example, you might remember that Jonah didn't want to deliver God's warning to the Ninevites, and he even tried to run away from the job. Why? Because he knew God would show mercy if they repented.
Yeah, that is why the story says he ran. Now, slightly off topic, but have you ever read the book of Jonah? It's only 4 chapters long. I definitely recommend it. It's got all sorts of superstitious nonsense in it that no Christian today would ever consider in a real-life scenario. When the weather gets bad on the ship, they all just assume that it's one of their gods being a dick. And when it continues, they cast lots to figure out which of them God is angry at. And by a game of random chance, the will of God is made clear that it's Jonah that is the cause of their bad weather. Would any Christian today, if they were on a boat in bad weather, ever think to cast lots to figure out which person on the boat God is mad at? Would they even begin with the assumption that the bad weather was actually God being mad at someone? And then when he goes to Nineveh, all he has to do is walk into the town and shout out, "Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown!" And immediately everyone just believes him, all the way up to the king who issued an official decree that the people should do as Jonah said. The modern-day equivalent would be if the mayor of New York were to write official city policy based on the ramblings of one of those "the end is near" people that everyone in reality ignores. The first 3 chapters of Jonah is the end-time preacher's wet dream. And the last chapter of Jonah is Jonah getting all pissy that everyone listened to him because he really wanted all of them to die horrible, horrible deaths.
Apparently, Jonah knew that God's justice always goes hand in hand with his compassion and mercy.
Mercy is literally the suspension of justice. It is logically impossible for justice to go hand in hand with mercy. And as apologists are fond of telling you, the question, can God make a rock so heavy that even he cannot lift it, is logically impossible. So the fact that God can't do that does not take away his omnipotence, because omnipotence is only about what is logically possible. So if that definition works, then by extension that means God cannot just ignore the logical impossibility of being perfectly just and perfectly merciful.
Number 2. God is willing to work with people where they are, not where they ought to be. He works within messy human cultures to move them towards redemption.
And total annihilation is a move toward redemption how?
When the Canaanites refused to repent, God finally brought judgment in a language they would understand, the language of war.
Yep, definitely no other possible way God could have gotten the message across other than killing them all. What was that saying about, resorting to violence being a failure of communication? Like, really, your argument here is that he's not dealing with the people as they ought to be, but dealing with them as they are. In other words, he's lowering himself to their level. Isn't he supposed to be better than that? And also, this smacks of an abusive parent telling their kid that if they keep crying, they'll give them a reason to cry, god damn it. But God is love, right?
In fact, war was an everyday part of life in the ancient Near East.
Almost like there wasn't a being who existed who had the ability to bring everyone together in peace and harmony. Unless, of course, you don't think that God had that ability, which would mean that he's not omnipotent. So if he had the ability to bring everyone together in peace and harmony, but opted for violence instead, what does that say about him? Yeah, free will or whatever. God is supposed to be omnipotent and omniscient, which means that he has the knowledge and power necessary to bring about peace and harmony without infringing on people's free will. Sure, if you want to limit God like that, you're welcome to do it. It's your God, after all, not mine, so if your definition of God is such that he does not have the ability to do such a thing, then I guess a certain amount of violence makes sense, but then it looks like an incompetent God bumbling around trying to solve problems that are beyond his abilities.
All nations at that time depended on war for survival or subjugated themselves to another nation for military protection.
And you'd think that a loving God could have passed on some knowledge about how to order society without the need for war or subjugation for military protection.
While it's hard for us to imagine a world where war is an everyday norm, God is always working within all cultures, no matter what their norm is.
Sadly, war is basically the norm in today's culture as well. It's just done in such a way as to keep most of the population that aren't directly involved mostly unaware of it, as is evidenced by your claim that war is not the norm today. Today, there has been a constant war in Afghanistan for the last 2 decades. In the 90s, we had the Persian Gulf War, the Third Balkan War, the Rwandan Genocide. In the 80s, we had the Iran-Iraq War, the Soviet-Afghan War. The 50s to 70s had the Vietnam War, the Sudanese Civil War, the French-Algerian War, the Korean War, among others, and I could keep going. And, of course, the war in Afghanistan is not the only war of the 21st century. It's just the one that's been with us for the entirety of the 21st century so far. There are a bunch more. Just because you can ignore it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So does that mean that genocide is an acceptable practice today, since war is our norm, so clearly war is a language that people can understand? I would hope that you would say no to that.
Just as we adapt our own behavior and language when we are in a different culture or country, the language of the ancient Near East was violence and war.
Well, aside from Hebrew, other Canaanite languages include Phoenician, Ammonite, Edomite, Moabite, and potentially Ekronite and Ugaritic. And yes, Hebrew was a Canaanite language. In fact, archaeological evidence points to the Hebrews having been a Canaanite culture themselves, with them being an organic branching off of similar cultures in the area rather than them conquering the area from outside by force. So, back to the languages. If us adjusting the language we speak depending on the culture we're in is a valid comparison, then God could have used one of these several Canaanite spoken languages to communicate with them rather than the language of physical violence.
And a victory by the Israelites, a much smaller and weaker nation than the Canaanites, suggested divine intervention.
Yeah, of course, the underdog never wins unless God intervenes directly. Why God couldn't have just intervened every time the Canaanites went to sacrifice a child is a mystery, but when the Israelites came to slaughter not only the children earmarked for sacrifice, but all the other ones as well, God intervened to make that possible. Also, fun fact, as long as we're talking child sacrifice again, weird that I would call that a fun fact, but here we are. It can and has been argued by some scholars that the ancient Hebrews engaged in the practice themselves, at least occasionally. The grammar of the Molech offerings that are usually interpreted as being offerings to the god Molech could also be interpreted as being a different type of offering. You know, you have your burnt offerings, your sin offerings, your grain offerings, and your Molech offerings, with the Molech offering being a child sacrifice. But by the time the Hebrew Bible was being written, the practice had fallen out of favor, and there are certain revisionist details included in the Bible to dissuade the practice. So make of that what you will.
It's also important to note that God instituted rules and limits to war that were against the norms of the time.
Yeah, there were rules about war that can be found in the Bible. And they're morally reprehensible. Basically, before laying siege to a city, you are to offer them terms. The terms being that they can either surrender and become your slaves, or if they fight, when you win, you kill all the men and take the women and children as slaves. Except for the cities of the Hittites, the Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Those motherfuckers were born in the wrong cities, so they all die, leave nothing alive that breathes. Was that progressive for the time? Maybe. Is God justified in giving people morally reprehensible rules to live by because he's being constrained by their culture? No. In fact, I would go so far as to argue that if the God of the Bible actually exists, he is the architect of the Hebrew culture, so if he couldn't build a more moral culture, that's on him.
He limited the Israelites to warfare only within specific circumstances and time frames, or for specific purposes.
One of those specific purposes is the acquisition of slaves. How incredibly moral.
God also limited who could fight, exempting those who had recently bought a house or a vineyard, or were engaged to be married, and even those who were just faint-hearted.
Well, it's a bit more specific than that. It's not if you've recently bought a house, it's if you've built a house and haven't dedicated it yet. It's not if you just bought a vineyard, it's if you planted a vineyard and haven't harvested anything from it yet. And it's not if you're engaged to be married, it's if you haven't taken her. You know, the sex thing. And yes, if you're a coward, go home, lest your cowardice spread to your fellows. So yeah, they provided some exemptions from conscription. That makes genocide moral how? This just seems like deflection.
There were even rules against needlessly destroying the nearby trees.
Well, it's too bad similar rules weren't in place for nearby babies.
God works with people where they are, not where they ought to be. And when he accommodates certain inferior conditions of a culture, it is to move people in a redemptive direction.
No, it's not. In no scenario is the entire extermination of a culture somehow redemptive for that culture.
In the case of the Canaanites, even beyond using Israel to stop their violence and evil, God was working to accomplish a larger plan, his mission to bring redemption to the entire cosmos.
Sorry, but, those Canaanite people, they were a part of the entire cosmos. Wiping them out irredeemably cannot bring redemption to the entire cosmos, pretty much by definition.
Even as he was judging the Canaanites, a seriously corrupting and evil force in the world, he was orchestrating the story of redemption, securing the land for Israel in which the Messiah for all nations would appear.
Except if Jesus was that Messiah, the land he appeared in was controlled by the Romans, not the Israelites. Seems like he could have skipped a step and had the Romans take care of things right from the get-go. Yeah, I know the Roman Empire didn't exist back then, but several genocides leading up to a big foreign conquest seems somewhat inefficient.
Number 3. The Old Testament's mention of many Canaanite survivors shows that its total kill language is simply ancient Near Eastern exaggeration or hyperbole.
So, if we're bringing the potential for exaggeration and hyperbole into the Bible, then why would that not also apply to the reasons why total extermination was justified? They were so bad, sacrificing babies and having ritualistic sex. They all need to be eliminated. Why would the all need to be eliminated part of that be an example of exaggeration, while the sacrificing babies and having ritualistic sex part is clearly literally true? What justification do you have for considering the one to be exaggeration but not the other?
Whenever we read ancient literature, we should try to understand the context in which it was written.
I agree. And contextually, it seems as though the claims of bad behaviors against the Canaanites were exaggerated in order to justify war against them. So why are you acting as though they were not?
Including what kind of literature it is and the language devices that were normal for that time. If I tell you my suitcase weighs a ton, you know that I mean it's heavy, not that it literally weighs 2,000 pounds. If I say I'm so hungry I could eat a horse, you would know that, at least in Western culture, I don't literally mean I will eat a horse, just that I'm very hungry.
Yes, expressions exist and are sometimes forms of exaggeration and hyperbole. We know. Now make with the explanation as to why the only part of the multiple genocides in the Bible that is exaggerated is the part that makes the Hebrews look bad rather than the other way around.
There are common hyperbolic expressions in every culture. In the culture of the ancient Near East, there were stock hyperbolic phrases about warfare. Sweeping language with utterly destroyed bravado was common in ancient Near Eastern war texts.
Sure, I can agree with that. So let's just assume that all of the genocides committed by the Hebrews against other cultures were exaggerated bravado. Now, what of the genocide committed by God himself? Remember that one? Noah's flood? Which, to be fair, I don't actually know what this organization's position is for the flood. Maybe they do think it was hyperbole as well, but given their general fundamentalist interpretations of things found in their other videos, I have my doubts.
In that literature, victories were often described in terms of total conquest, complete annihilation, and leaving no survivors.
Yes, like I said, I'd agree that stuff like that is clearly hyperbolic, but what about something like 1 Samuel 15? That's where God commands King Saul to kill every Amalekite and all their animals, an order which Saul carries out for the most part. He spares their king, and they keep the best of the livestock for themselves. This sparing of one person and some animals is what makes God regret ever having made Saul king in the first place. That doesn't sound hyperbolic. That sounds more like Saul taking God's instructions as hyperbole, and then God getting mad that he didn't take them more literally.
One Moabite king wrote of his victory over Israel by saying, "Israel is no more." Both his ancient Near Eastern readers and readers today understand this was hyperbole and not literally true.
Okay, but there's a difference between saying Israel is no more when talking about a nation and saying go forth and kill all the men, women, children, babies, and livestock. You can destroy a nation without destroying all of the people, but when you explicitly say to destroy the people, it leaves the question of hyperbole in doubt.
The total kill language in the Old Testament command was closely followed by directions to not intermarry with the Canaanites, the ones who were supposedly to be wiped out.
Oh yeah, I forgot. She's sticking with the Canaanites and ignoring the other genocides. No such command followed the Amalekite genocide. Samuel makes it very explicit to King Saul that God was angry that he did not follow his instructions to the letter. So much for their chance to repent.
In fact, the biblical language of the Canaanite destruction is identical to that of Judah's destruction in the Babylonian exile, which clearly did not mean utter annihilation or genocide.
Okay, well, let's compare the two, since they are identical. The book of 2 Kings chapter 25 details the fall and capture of Judah. So, side by side, let's put one of the Canaanite genocides with one of the verses from 2 Kings 25. Joshua 6:21. Then they devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, with the edge of the sword. But now the account of the fall of Judah, 2 Kings 25:12 says, "But the captain of the guard left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen." That doesn't quite seem to be identical. Now, maybe I'm not looking at the right verse. That's entirely possible. The Bible repeats itself a lot. So maybe one of the other versions of that story does use identical language, but I couldn't find it. If they really were identical, you'd think that you could have shown the verses themselves, but notably, this is not the first time that they've left a biblical citation out that I've had to go hunting for, and usually it seems to be because the context of the verse makes it obviously worse than what is being presented in the video, like the rules about war, for instance.
In both cases, people from these nations turned to God and were accepted into Israel.
The genocide was not 100% genocide, it was only an attempted genocide, therefore it was morally good. Also, accepted into Israel, based on my understanding of the ancient Hebrew culture, would have essentially involved abandoning their culture and being assimilated into the Hebrew culture, so it's still cultural genocide.
God even made Rahab, one of the Canaanite women who turned to God, one of the great-great-great-great-grandmothers of Jesus.
Well, as long as we're on the subject of looking at the cultural and historical context of the Bible, it bears mentioning that it was a relatively common practice for important figures to have mythologized genealogies that would tie their lineage to various other important figures in the culture. So, for instance, the lineage of Julius Caesar was traced back to his common ancestor with Romulus and Remus, and from there to the goddess Venus. Given that Jesus has two conflicting genealogies in the Bible, is such mythologization not an incredibly plausible scenario?
All this indicates that to some degree, the language used in the Old Testament about utterly destroying the Canaanites was hyperbolic. Passages dealing with God's command to drive out the Canaanites from the land are difficult passages to read, and we have to be honest with those difficulties and resist offering trite answers.
Instead, it's important to engage in motivated reasoning and pretending that there exists a crime that, if committed, can justify at least the attempt of genocide against a whole people, including those members of that society that did not participate in the commission of that crime.
But the first step to understanding what happened and why is to evaluate the context of the biblical narrative and the ancient Near Eastern culture.
The ancient Near Eastern culture, particularly the one that was designed by God to include the idea that one group of people is entitled to the land currently occupied by another group of people who are conveniently portrayed as engaging in all sorts of heinous activities that the archaeological evidence suggests were also engaged in by the people of Israel, who were themselves Canaanites. Or do you just want us to consider the context that you provided without actually putting any thought into the scholarly consensus on the context? That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from an email I got this morning. It is, rather ironically, a bit of a long and rambling email, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but essentially it breaks down to good videos, but I wish you'd be less verbose and more concise. First, I want to say thank you. I do appreciate the feedback even when I disagree. But I do disagree, because the reason I'm not as concise as I could be is essentially to make sure all of my bases are covered. Over the years, I've developed a sense for what kinds of responses I'll get in the comments to statements that I am making, and this enables me to sometimes anticipate objections to what I am saying, and so preemptively respond to those objections. You can actually watch this happen over the lifespan of my channel. When I first started, I very rarely released a video that was more than 15 minutes long, and now I rarely release one that is under 15 minutes long. And that's just a contributing factor. There are other reasons for the length of the videos. Sometimes I get bored with countering the same points over and over again, so I'll use that point as a bit of an awkward springboard to discuss something that I find a bit more interesting. Amusingly, as part of the email, they essentially rewrote a part of one of my scripts in order to provide an example of a more concise statement that I could have made instead of the one that I did make. And in response to that, and I mean this sincerely, I'm not just trying to be glib or dismissive here, and this actually goes for anyone, not just the person who emailed me, but if you think you can make a better response to one of the videos that I've responded to, then make it. I do not have a monopoly on the market. I would love to see new creators try their hands at response videos. Having a diversity of creators and opinions increases the likelihood that we'll have a real impact on someone's life somewhere. And also, today, the day I'm recording this, is the day that I released my 35-minute response to Brian Holdsworth. The second comment on that video was, "Yay, a longer video!" And then a few minutes later, I got another comment that said, "Thank you for evolving your argumentation to be more concise and quicker to the point." So today has been a very confusing day for me. Y'all need to stop sending me mixed messages. But also, sending mixed messages is good for engagement, so go ahead and give that algorithm a boost and tell me how much you hate/love when my videos are longer/shorter than this one. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the clear and concise messaging that can be found on my channel. If you'd like to be verbose, loquacious, repetitive, and tautological, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description. If you'd like to listen to my videos in podcast form, the link for that is also in the description, as well as links to my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!